Howdy, all you delicious people. I'm here today to review two movies. I'm here to review a movie called You're Next. I'm also here to review a Keanu Reeves movie called Knock Knock. Ultimately, in a way that you can say that you saw this film, you're ultimately going to Keanu Reeves' Knock Knock by going into an app called Tubi, Tubi. It's a free movie and TV service at the end of the day that you can say that you saw this movie and check it out for absolutely free. The only thing that you probably need to do is uh, kind of log in via your Facebook or your Google or your whatever and go into this app and there, in fact, watch a number of movies for absolutely free. There's no fee, nothing like that. You're next. Ultimately, currently, to the second this recording, I don't have a convenient way to say that you saw this movie at some point without there being some kind of rental fee involved, or basically you going on some app somewhere and buying the movie down outright or buying the disc. Ultimately, this movie is good enough for me to say for you to go out of your way to buy it, but reasonably, a lot of people might not feel the same. Ultimately, in the same vein, I would probably suggest for maybe just people to go into any number of any movie free apps and they're in fact probably search to ultimately see if ultimately this is a movie you could see on said app. I've been using Movie Box Plus technically a lot to try to find either new releases or anything of old fashioned nature, so maybe you could find Your Next on that app, or there are in fact any number of different apps that you could find to rewind in time to watch a movie. So let's both get into both of these movies. At some point, I'm going to be talking at them at first, a very cryptic like sense. Then eventually, I will break down a double 5-timed count, and then after that amount of time, we're going to get into spoilers about this movie. Each time, if ultimately you want to be completely 100% avoid of all spoilers, you can ultimately wait and fast track forward through the video for you to ultimately see me transition um, like this. And once you do that, you can probably dare in fact be avoided of all spoilers whatsoever if you dare say would want to. So you can do this entire video without getting any blip of spoilers, or at the end of the day, you can hear only spoilers if that's what you want to do. So let's talk about Your Next. So basically, this movie is a family reunion film that ultimately has it to where there's a very well-off family to where they have this big mansion-like home, and so ultimately we have Aaron and Crispin and Aaron, who ultimately arrive. It seems like this woman is brand new to this family, and ultimately she's like, "Yeah, I don't know if I'm gonna kind of win them over," and yeah, I don't know. Just because of her kind of background, or when eventually she's going to tell them about her history or her kind of past. But yeah, it seems like people are warming up to her fairly easily. Maybe not as much as like Crispin's return home, because immediately he's kind of welcomed with, "Yeah, it doesn't really seem like things are quite working out with you." And of course, we have this character Drake that is seeming to be a guy that is kind of really uh, stabbing people in the front metaphorically and twisting the knife and watching people squirm, again metaphorically. um, so reasonably, we have it to where in this movie we get a lot of shock value like moments where a lot of times like really being put on edge with the whole fact of what the F is Aaron doing in this movie. good God, she is a like. If she said "Hasta la vista, baby," I'd be like, yeah, that's freaking Arnold at work there. Good God, this woman is just an unstoppable force. And reasonably, we eventually go into this movie about a lot of shock value moments, and it gets to the point where ultimately, like, I didn't want to come into this movie with any kind of real like assessments of what's kind of going on. I just kind of wanted to watch this movie in severe ignorant bliss, and then ultimately just be like, oh, okay, I get this now. Okay, I understood. Oh, hey, that's kind of interesting. Um, like, I didn't want to come in here trying to figure out the puzzle uh, before, like, putting it together. Like, I just wanted to just kind of enjoy the monotonous kind of putting the pieces together, and then like, oh yeah, it is a wheel, or it is a map, or it is a whatever. I think that's what this movie really was to me. It was just kind of like an ignorant bliss of just kind of enjoying this movie and having it be that real one of a kind like movie where like Erin is just freaking awesome in this movie. And not only is she awesome in this movie, like she basically changes for the fact of like, okay, we can finally have like a girl in the movie not have to like be like squirming and hiding and running through like 75% of the film, and then like the last like X amount of film, like she has to be this very confident person, and then have to like confront said people and take them down or take them out or or do whatever she needs to do. So all trying as much as possible to say things in a very cryptic like motion, but kind of teeing people up to kind of what to expect for this movie. Yeah, there's a lot of like, whoa, you're not expecting these kinds of moments, especially if you haven't heard much about this movie. Um, and you're eventually trying to, and you're eventually like starting to put the pieces together as you are very much kind of going along of like, okay, what was the point of especially the beginning of this movie? You're like, what was the point of the beginning of this movie? And then it comes back around, and then you're like, oh, okay, gotcha. I'm like, I didn't understand this at first, but I'm like, what the F freaking point of the beginning of this movie was? Then you figure it out later. All right, okay. Um, so yeah, I think that's all that I could probably say in a very cryptic like sense, because ultimately, like, I almost kind of teed it up very much for even the cryptic like sense of really just almost breaking the movie down um, right right away. So, anyways, I think it's about that time to go into spoilers about this movie. At the end of the day, I thought there was some uh, like I didn't care that this movie probably felt like a fairly like cheaply done film. Like cheaply done meaning like it felt like there was not a lot of money put into this film, but I was like, just again, ignorant bliss. There was some shock value moments that ultimately, like, again, when I was just kind of like plopping my brain off to the side and enjoying this movie for what it was and not having to come up with any kind of conclusions until eventually the movie presents it to me. I'm like, oh, okay, good. This is really good. I really liked it. I really enjoyed it. So let's get into spoiler time. Spoiler time. It's about that time again to spoil this movie. So ultimately, like I said, there's a family reunion. We ultimately have Erin and Crispin. I keep trying to say that because ultimately I feel like if I don't say Crispin enough, that I probably will forget this name. So if I probably do forget, I'll probably just call him Chris because it's easier. So we ultimately have all these family members just bringing on in the house, and it seems like I believe Crispin is a writer, and so eventually we go into knowing that Aaron was Crispin's like previous employer. I think it was like his AP or his like just yeah, his assistant at some point. Anyways, yeah, mood aspect of journeys of which and whatever. So we come into this family reunion, and ultimately we have Drake, who is God. He is just a schmuck. Just this guy. I like for a lot of this for beginning of this movie. I really did not like this guy because he was kind of annoying, and ultimately he was the guy that was like the older brother that had to like really tell every other brother that he is the older brother and that he has to kind of give him noogies and wedgies and whatever, like that kind of brother kind of going on with this movie to just like cement that, oh yeah, like hey, like you're still my other younger brother, hey, you're fat and you're whatever, sucks to be you. So eventually we just push on into uh, the dinner. And so the dinner is where things are eventually going to slowly but surely pick up. So we go into this dinner, and like we have some of the brothers that ultimately they have their certain professions here and there, and so eventually we get down to one of the brothers just kind of like sticking his head out at the window, just kind of looking around because he thought he sees something, and eventually he sees more than he bargained for with a arrow to the head or to the face. He drops like a log, so all of a sudden now we have everybody kind of scrambling underneath this table. There is like one person that is like right in front of the window, and she is just screaming. She's like ah, and so we have Drake that ultimately like rushes to her, and he gets a freaking arrow in the back for his troubles. So what they all decide to do is basically they have it to where, okay, hey guys, we have to make it like out of this room. There's too many windows, like eventually we're eventually going to get shot. So reasonably we got to make it out of here. You got to get out of here to where there's a place where there's fewer windows, and there's a better chance we can ultimately go and try to find some help, because yeah, none of their cell phones work. We ultimately have crappy Felix, or like I think his name is Felix. I could be wrong. Um, he ultimately mentions something about there being some device to block cell phones, and it only costs like $30. I'm like, that seems like a bizarrish thing that he should have knowledge about. Like, this guy seems very unsavory to me right now. What the F is this? But I guess even if we were to get into spoilers, it's spoilers. So, but I'm like, this guy is like, so, anyways, why does he have that information? It seems so out of left and right and center field. It basically covers the entire outfield with weird. So ultimately, we have it to where they decide to all get chairs. Take the chairs as their like human shields or their kind of shields to block them from the arrows coming in from the window. So reasonably, people are grabbing the chairs and they're crazily running to the door because they're gonna try to make a run for it. Uh, Literally after this. So everybody starts grabbing a chair and everybody starts making a run for it. Even the guy that has a freaking arrow to the back. Uh, like I feel like there's a Skyrim reference that I should make here. Arrow to the knee, arrow to the back. Am I gonna have to get some sweet roll or something? I don't know. So we ultimately have our characters that ultimately all make it through the kitchen undead, or they're not zombies. They're all okay. So their plan of attack is to, hey, let's go and make a run for the car because this guy has an arrow to the back, and since we can't call for help, like I think the next plan should be to try to send somebody out who can hopefully get help. And so reasonably they ask around the family who is the fastest runner, and everybody is making this call. I think it comes down to, I think, mostly like Drake says that he is a runner. I'm like, dude, you have a freaking arrow to the back. There's no way you're gonna be running anywhere. Uh, like recently, I think Crispin ultimately says that he's a fast runner, and ultimately they make another fat joke and whatever. So ultimately there's kind of like either it's Crispin or it's the daughter, and ultimately the daughter of this family, and ultimately they decide it's the daughter. So they open the doors and she comes flying out the door, and sadly enough her throat gets cut with his piano wire. And so basically, she goes down like a sack of potatoes, and they drag her back into the house to slowly but surely see her bleed to death. And the mother is so grief stricken that she goes up to her room, goes into her bed, and the father like follows her to said room. So we have it to where it feels that certain people are starting to think that eventually these guys are going to probably start coming into the home. And so reasonably we have Erin that is really starting to kind of come up with her own like Home Alone kind of esh like traps. Like very much she and I'm gonna probably do these like in the movie terms kind of out of order. It's probably like I'm gonna probably just place all the what she kind of does. And it's not gonna be in order of the movie, so hopefully nobody's upset by that. Um, Ultimately, we have some people that start to scatter. I think Felix has the plan about hiding out in the basement, and ultimately we have it to where uh, when some people are trying to hide, or some people are trying to run out uh, outside after the girl ends up getting her throat cut. It seems like some people are trying to dodge the wire, and the one guy who ends up having an arrow in the back, he freaking runs, but sadly enough, the the string ends up hitting the guy's arrow in his back, and so ultimately he like screams in pain. But then he just ends up freaking taking and grabbing the arrow with his hand and ripping it out of his own back, and then he falls over, and he's like, "Whoa!" He falls over. So we and here's the odd beginning of this movie, because I didn't mention that. Uh, we have a couple that is making adult content. They are definitely doing some thick, juicy, delicious adult content early in this movie. Because we have a young girl who is forcibly being with an older man, and ultimately the guy goes to get something and finds that his younger girl is dead, with a window that opens up and says you're next. And so shortly thereafter he is then killed. And so reasonably this younger girl is basically sleeping with this older man just because he's rich, that he has money, that he's loaded. And so eventually we find these guys with these sheep and these wolf masks and stuff like that. They had killed these people, and that's how this movie opens. And I'm like, okay, this is a very weird and bizarre opening, but it makes sense later on. So eventually we have to where one of the people that scramble to run out of the house eventually run to the neighbors. Here's where we kind of like, here's reason why I mentioned that scene just then. One of the people run to the neighbor's house to find out that same neighbor was the neighbor that had been just killed, like I just mentioned. And so she tried to like go, hey, yeah, hey, like please help me. And then she realizes that those people are dead. So these guys had bunkered down into this home until the coast was clear to, dare say, go out of the way to um, to kill this family, or try to kill this family. And so they bunkered into this home, and that's why they kill these people in the beginning of this movie, because now it makes sense. So ultimately, Erin again is putting her home alone, like traps going on throughout this home. She bizarrely is putting nails on boards and placing them right near the windows. To ultimately assume that any stupid klutz guy that ultimately can't otherwise see a nick of anything because their masks probably don't have the greatest vision, are ultimately gonna step right into the home and step on a nail and ultimately just be like, ah. So we ultimately have that going on, but not only that, but then also Erin has like a number of weird barrages of like knives and like everything that she could take from the kitchen she takes, and she ultimately just starts uh like making all of like these plans to just be like, okay, well, like I'm gonna take all these guys out. And so Felix's wife ultimately asks this girl, it's like, hey, like, seems like you really know what you're doing. And ultimately Erin says, it's like, well, yeah, like my dad had made me do like survival training. I'm like, God, like we get to know a little bit about Aaron, but we never really get to know enough. Like in the dinner, like we get to find out like Drake has to bring up that Aaron was Crispin's um AP or his assistant, and recently we get to find a little bit about that and how basically their love was kind of like technically illegal or whatever, but uh, like who cares? It just like meh, whatever. Like they ended up just falling for one another while they were working with one another. So, anyways, we have it to where eventually these characters are starting to the sheep head or the fox head or the the lamb head or whoever, all those kind of guys with all these masks are starting to make their way into the home. Eventually, the guy thinks that he is going to avoid the nail with the nail piece of wood thing. So he looks and he thinks he's going to avoid it. So ultimately he adjusts his foot and lands on another one anyways, and then writhes in pain afterwards. So we eventually at some point have Aaron get caught off guard by one of the killers because ultimately she ultimately has one killer that she takes out by the kitchen, and she starts like jabbing him with a bunch of like utensils and whatever she can find, and like kills him right next to the door as this guy was trying to make his way in. And so then Aaron eventually gets caught off guard in the uh, in the dining room and eventually takes a meat cleaver to this freaking guy, just freaking bashes his brains in, and I'm like, oh my god, this is freaking awesome. So, and we eventually have it to where Felix takes Drake down to the basement and is trying to doctoring him up. And eventually we are starting to see like Felix, and like we're starting to not quite exactly like what we see really, because Felix eventually it just gets to the point to where Felix is supposedly a doctor, I believe, and so ultimately he is going to start bandaging Drake up. And so kind of when Drake kind of comes to after he passes out, basically Felix decides to take a bunch of screwdrivers and drive them all into Drake to where Drake all falls over. And so we realize that Felix is actually working with these guys. I'm like, oh my god, this is awful. You have a family member that eventually, I guess, wants the inheritance, so it makes sense. And it seems like his wife is a real B word, is a real bit. And ultimately, I'm like, yeah, like, I didn't like her at all. Like, there's something about her that was unsettling for most of this movie. So, and it was weird that he brought up that $30 thing about that whole uh, gizmo thing that blocks cell phone calls. I'm like, what the crap is that? Why would you bring that up? It stuck out to me. And so ultimately, he brought that up. I'm like, this is gonna mess me up for the rest of the day of wanting to accuse this guy, and then me probably being horribly wrong the entire time, but then me absolutely being right. So we ultimately have it to where, okay, we get to the point to where Aaron is killing so many effing people at this point that it gets to the aspect of her just killing all of these like sheep, wolf guys. It gets to the point where she takes like a camera and has this like flash thing repetitively going, um, because one of the goons follows her down in this room. So she has this like flashing camera repeatedly going off, blinding this guy, and so eventually she takes him down and stabs the crap out of him, and kills him. So and she does all these like gruesome and odd and interesting kills. And yeah, so eventually they are not quite certain how many more of these goons there are. But ultimately, we have Aaron, who ultimately tells Crispin to run for it, to try to find help, to try to get somebody, hopefully to call somebody. And so Crispin leaves for Aaron to just start killing everybody. And so ultimately, I'm just like, okay, like Crispin at the end of this movie is going to be bringing in the cavalry, and like because he seems very innocent, he seems kind of very like okay, I think I can trust this guy. All right, yeah, he's gonna send in the cavalry, he's gonna call in the sheriff and this and that. So Aaron again killing everybody. It ends up we find out that when Felix and his wife go upstairs, that the like one of the masked men ended up killing his mother. And then when Felix and his wife open the door to talk to his father, one of the masked men kills his father right in front of him, to the point where there's blood that ends up on Felix's face. And like if at first we weren't sure about Drake stabbing or Felix stabbing Drake, we could really confirm now that it's like okay, the masked man is working with Felix. And basically because he's like, you seriously had to do that right in front of me. It's like, really, come on, like you didn't have to do that. So eventually it seems like Felix is very much like it doesn't really feel like he's getting what he paid for. And so eventually we have it to where immediately we are getting to the aspect of like Aaron ultimately planting a axe contraption if someone were to open the front door. And ultimately we have it to where seemingly at some point that there is another goon that is ultimately going to come for Aaron, and that goon is eventually going to be met by Drake, who is absurdly still alive. And eventually he is still alive, and he is saving Aaron from a death. And I'm like, oh my god, Drake, You totally redeem yourself by the end of this movie there, buddy. And so he surprisingly comes out of nowhere and saves Aaron, makes the save, and then eventually like dies shortly thereafter. And so like basically we have it to where it seems like Aaron is really not quite buying Felix's story, Felix and Felix's wife's story. It seems like stuff is starting to come out very much a little bit thin. So ultimately, it seems like Aaron is very much more not knowing who to trust anymore and takes a blender and freaking kills Felix with a blender and then stabs Felix's wife in the head. And I'm just like, man, like just the deaths are just piling up in this movie. So eventually we have Aaron, who basically, if not everybody in this house is dead, then like basically like she's kind of just killed almost everyone with the exception of one or two people seemingly at this point by her not killing innocent people. Oh man, the girl that ends up running in the neighbor's home, she freaking gets uh her head freaking like it was a very vicious like golf tee up kind of kill. God, that was awesome. So we eventually have it to where okay, Aaron is outside and like coming for Crispin, and ultimately he kind of breaks down and because there's only like so much that eventually it kind of gets to the point of having to tell Aaron the truth because eventually uh Crispin calls Felix and tells him, "Hey, is it all over with?" It's like, "I'm sorry I couldn't like be on here be in the house longer. I couldn't deal with all the blood." And so Aaron eventually finds out that Crispin is tied to this whole like inheritance thing. He desperately needed the money, and so eventually Aaron confronts Crispin and he confesses the whole thing that she was basically supposed to be a witness to all this, that she was supposed to survive, and um, that Crispin and Felix and his wife were supposed to get out of this with the inheritance, and then still have to pay a lot of the killers for the fee. Because ultimately, yeah, that's kind of the offset thing of this whole trope is just the fact that uh, now that all these guys are dead, well, there's no fee that they have to they have to pay for. Um, and so reasonably, like he is like basically like mentioning to her, it's like yeah, and we really didn't expect how you were so good at just killing people like he kind of really gives her mad props about just like yeah we were so unexpected at how like great you were going to be at all this. So eventually he is kind of telling her everything that he thinks she needs to hear, and he basically tells her that he loves her and he wants to marry her so that way they can uh, like give her a portion of the inheritance, because at first, like, he was gonna give her some kind of hush money if anything else, but like, if anything, she wasn't gonna put up with any kind of hush money whatsoever. So she basically stabs Crispin multiple times and then kills him, ultimately to where a cop from a window shoots her in like the shoulder or something, and ultimately takes her down, to where we have to where a cop uh, comes in from the front door, and she's like, no, not from the front door, and frickin' the axe comes down and frickin' kills him. And that is just how the movie eventually just ends. There might have been some stuff here and there that I probably left out or probably rushed through, because ultimately, who knows if people still enjoy this movie. It's a fairly old film, and at the end of the day, maybe people were more interested in Knock Knock rather than the review of Your Next. I kind of want to get this out there because ultimately I don't know if exactly I felt that I really gave a true legitimate review of this movie at some point. So I ultimately just kind of thought that I should put this out there. Really talked about how I enjoyed it and how I think this movie is worthwhile to see, if ultimately or worthwhile seeing again if ultimately in the end you only maybe saw it once or barely saw it or saw bits and pieces of it. It's worth seeing all the way through. It's a very interesting story. I really enjoyed it. So at the end of the day, let's go on to the knock knock. The knock knock. The knock knock joke. So a Keanu Reeves movie taking place within Father's Day, bizarrely. Talking about this movie in a very cryptic like sense, we ultimately have to break it down and really go into like Keanu Reeves being a really great father, really being like overall just like for the most point, a lot of people kind of have their kind of 50-50 kind of flavor at some points, kind of ultimately saying sometimes that sometimes Keanu's acting in this movie at some points was over the top, and some people like me enjoyed it. There was a lot of kind of times where I was just like, no, I feel everything was reasonably done. I think at a lot of points, you got to see some sides of Keanu which you would normally see in a lot of other movies. So that's kind of where I kind of was won over by Keanu, and that's kind of where I went to mostly. Going into this movie, we have Keanu, who is playing a father, and that father is on Father's Day, thinking that he should be able to go on vacation, but instead he is left to work at home. Ultimately, previously a DJ, now currently an architect, which is a weird career move. Basically, this character is now waiting for up and breath to get a FaceTime from his wife, which is kind of hilarious, knowing full well the director who had talked about this film because he had worked with him on Knock Knock, who's there, Keanu Reeves. Keanu Reeves evidently doesn't really quite understand technology all that well. Evidently, when he was shooting this movie and doing FaceTime or whatever that was that they're doing FaceTime, I'm assuming he really didn't understand how it works. He didn't understand how they could see him and vice versa. He didn't understand technology. And then when also he was shooting a movie, evidently information was dropped that the people working for the CGI stuff for the Matrix, he had given them gifts, and so ultimately those gifts had been kind of jazzed up or exaggerated or whatever, And so ultimately, like Keanu um, had evidently saw this thing being released on Reddit, and so ultimately he went to like the people he worked with, and he's like, "Well, is there any way to kind of like take this down? Like I don't want people to know that I did something for them. It's like if anything, it's like yeah, so I gave them presents. So what? Like why not? They worked really hard and blah blah blah." But yeah, so Keanu like didn't realize that like Reddit is something that you can just jot anything down and like it can't just get removed. So yeah, uh, funny enough, little anecdote about Keanu, little thing about Keanu. Anyways, yeah, going so ultimately, if Keanu Reeves probably has a Twitter or a Facebook or a whatever, he probably doesn't even know how to use it. So if he probably actually uses it, there's probably some other person that's actually working behind him, which is perfectly fine because at the end of the day, in some way, he does he really need a social media presence? Does he really need to? Does he really need to be the Keanu Reeves of social media? I don't think he does. But because he's probably so nice, he'll probably lend himself to maybe even doing something as a Skype or something along those lines. Do a convention somewhere down the road, maybe for Constantine or something along those lines. Maybe somewhere in the future, right? Or has that already happened? Yes, it has. So going into this, yeah, talking about this movie very cryptically, again, kind of teeing it up. Not only is this guy waiting to hear a phone call from his wife that is away, he's ultimately also waiting for something to come knocking at his doorstep and him having to handle and hassle and go through the niceties of ultimately going, okay, well, I guess I'll be as nice as possible to help what is to come at my door. And but after some notion of time, I am going to be completely in a bind. And in all actuality, Keanu Reeves becomes heavily, let's just say, screwed. So yeah, he basically becomes screwed. So yeah, basically, if not for social medias and stuff like that, basically ruining him, but then also just any other kinds of other things that he had sadly forcibly been tied into within this movie. So I think this is a very interesting movie. I really like the kind of like tone of which like Keanu like he kind of goes from like a really nice guy to eventually at some point he twists and turns into this very vicious esh like actor character at some point that eventually just starts spouting nonsense and basically just shouts like um, that he had yes he had been tempted but ultimately he had brought free pizza to them and everything like that. So yeah, pretty funny, pretty interesting, pretty overly kind of interesting way to kind of get us to invest in a character. It really feels like Keanu seemed to really do his work when going into this whole thing. And so, yeah, I think that's about all that I can talk about this movie in a very cryptic like sense. Yeah, it didn't take very long, but when also looking at it, the review, like, kind of once you have to basically show your cards, which is the hook, basically after that it's just like gangbusters. You're pretty much just like having to basically say okay, here's what happens now. So I think now is that time to say here is whoa happens now, what happens now. So let's get into double five times territory, and then at the end of the day, we could say that we went into spoiler time. Spoiler time is about that time again to spoil this movie. I wouldn't say that this is a bad film. Ultimately, I would say that it's kind of like it's a one that kind of like for like looking at some other Keanu Reeves movies, there had been worse Keanu Reeves movies. That there have been more irrelevant Keanu Reeves movies. And I think every once in a while, everybody will pop their head and be like, "Hey, yeah, hey, look at this movie," and kind of take it for what it is instead of pulling it apart for what it was, and ultimately realize again when looking at a numerous other barrage of kind of Keanu Reeves movies, again, this one isn't that bad. And again, you can see this movie currently the second it's recording on Tubi, Tubi. It's a free movie and TV service at the end of the day. Anyways, let's get into spoilers. So, knock knock. We ultimately have a father who is very much cozying up with the mama bear, and he's mentioning how it is the father of days, the Father's Day, and so ultimately he thinks that he's going to get some adult content. It seems like the wife is starting out with some adult content, but then eventually the kids get into the room and then ultimately wreck their adult content time. It seems that they end up giving Keanu's character a face full of cake, and he ultimately um, is talking to his wife after his kids leave, and he's like, "Well, like I'm still hoping that we can get my present." And so ultimately, she's like, "You know what? Like the kids are up. It's too late now." And he's like, "Oh, monster, be mad." And so she's like, "Well, once we come back from my exhibition, like we'll make up for that." And he's like, "Monster is happy," and then she leaves. So Keanu eventually has it to where he talks to his kids, has a normal kind of breakfast, and eventually ships them off to go on their vacation. And yeah, very authentic, like Keanu playing a dad and this and that and everything along those lines. Very authentic, and from what I believe, maybe people feel otherwise. So justifiably, we go into now. Keanu is listening to music and working on his architectural projects. He's a little behind, and ultimately, he is also listening to some sweet tracks of music. Eventually, he completely turns off said music because ultimately his wife is FaceTiming him or whatever Snapchat or whatever app service that they're doing a little jingle jangle. So ultimately he is still kind of remiss that he is missing out on this vacation, but he's like, well, sorry, behind on projects. Ultimately, because she mentions like how basically she wished that he was there, ba 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 ba. So eventually hang up with phone call. Eventually he turns music back on, and eventually we have a ring-a-ding at the doorbell. Ultimately, this ring-a-ding is met by two women that are drenched in what would be called the waterish rain. And so ultimately, these girls are talking about, yeah, hey, uh, we have just been kind of going from like door to door, asking if this is the right address or not. And because ultimately, yeah, my phone went dead. Like, we've been driving around a taxi for like 20 some odd minutes. Like, I'm just kind of hoping to get the right address. So, yeah. and he's like, well, hey, like, do you want me to, uh, do you have it on, do you have the address on your phone? And she's like, well, hey, yeah, like, both of our phones are soaking wet, like, they don't work, and this and that. So eventually, Keanu says, hey, well, let me take your phone. Eventually, he puts a cell phone in rice. Evidently, if your cell phone is soaking wet, you put it in rice, and it dries out. Unique, the more you know, kind of thing going on there. So eventually, he says, "Okay, how about like I'll do this? Like I'll give you guys an iPad um, and I'll get you guys some towels because ultimately they're gonna um, she's gonna go through her social media and find her friend's address and then ultimately uh, call an Uber as well. So reasonably, of course, he gets this iPad, leaves the door open, gets the iPad, gets the towels, and so the girls seemingly start making themselves within this home. At first, like they start to be in front of the door, but then eventually they're in another portion of said home. And they said, yeah, we wanted to kind of get warmer. It was really cold over there. So I'm like, dude, Keanu, like they're just gonna transfer over your house, dude. It's gonna be bad. So ultimately, he gives them the iPad, gives them the towels, and so eventually they get the address and they say, okay, well, hey, like, we're calling an Uber. Hey, can you help us out? That like, it would be great for us to go to this party and have dry clothes. If anything, can we like use your dryer? And he's like, sure. So both the girls go and are wearing robes. So ultimately, we have while they wait, ultimately Keanu is talking about how he is talking about him and his wife and his very elongated marriage, and ultimately talking about that he used to be a like now he's an architect. He used to be a DJ, and so they start talking about music, and ultimately he likes, I believe, he likes French music. They start talking in French, um, and then ultimately he plays a song that ultimately one of the girls likes. She starts dancing, and so ultimately, yeah, like this guy's a DJ kind of seemingly everywhere around the world. So eventually, we get to have Keanu eventually talking seemingly where this is going up a slope of discussions of really talking about a relationship of monogamy between him and his wife. Like, how is it that you do it, that you've done it for so long without adding in another person and this and that? And he's like, well, hey, like, me and my wife have been together for a very long time. It always works. Um, and so ultimately, like, the girls are like comparing and how, like, there's one of her friends that's like a starfish and this and that no one would want to be with her because she's a starfish and this and that. So eventually we go into the aspect of seemingly more and more just teasing Keanu, just kind of making him uncomfortable and getting to the aspect to where basically they ultimately ask him if, hey, by the way, can we also like borrow your shower? Can we go in your shower? And he's ultimately just like, sure, all right, great, yeah, might as well, because they've already been rained on already. So ultimately, the clothes are what would be called pretty much dry by Keanu standards, and so eventually he goes into the bathroom and he lets him know that he's coming in, and basically tells him, hey, your clothes, here they are. And by and large, they are both peering at him in the bathroom with, let's just say, not a towel between them. So ultimately, thereafter, this becomes adult content. And trying as much as possible to say a review in a much cleaner direction now, because forcibly having to. Adult content always comes up when a certain kind of content usually appears via YouTube. So, anyways, adult content appears, and it quite frequently appears within this movie. So, I might have to say that yet again at some point. So, Keanu wakes up, ultimately assumes that the girls had left for the day, and so ultimately he's just like, oh yeah, I got rid of them. Great. Like, they must have just had their fun, and because ultimately their Uber car had arrived, and basically what had happened was they, let's just say, slept the night away. So ultimately they slept the night away to where ultimately in the very next morning he's waking up to thinking that they are gone and that he is resolved of all this. And he's like, well, hey, just one night of ignorant bliss, I guess. And so ultimately he is just kind of going through his home, just kind of collecting uh, his things here and there, just to kind of see if anything is missing. And he is not only missing things, he is gaining a couple things called women that are basically eating his pancakes. And basically, he's like, oh, yeah, I didn't expect you girls to still be here. I thought you guys would have been gone. So it ends up that the girls pretty much mention it's like, well, hey, where would we go? Where would we be? And it kind of gets to the point to where it seems that their address that they were supposedly going to go to was a fabrication. And so Keanu Reeves is just like, well, hey, if you need to go anywhere, like, we can go. Like, drop everything now and we can just go wherever you need to go. I'll drive you. Or I can call you a Uber or whatever. So ultimately the girls go into basically before they had told him that they were flight attendants, and then they ultimately tell him that that was a lie. And basically, this is where they start to scare Keanu by basically telling him that they're much younger than they actually are, and lie. Everything is scaring Keanu to where it's ultimately um, wanting him to not really kind of just be worried about, like, okay, like, what do I say now? And so ultimately, these girls are basically saying that they want to spend a week with him and whatever. And he's just like, no, like, if anything, my family's coming back this after this weekend. So, uh, like, thanks for last night. But if anything, it's time to get dressed and get ready to go. Get ready to go. So ultimately, here's where the fun begins. So we ultimately have Keanu telling the two girls to get dressed, and basically they are stubbornly not really wanting to get dressed. One of the girls is hiding out in his closet, and so ultimately she is hiding in his closet and then basically, like, appearing to him and then ultimately saying, like, oh, can we hug one more time? Can like, I desperately need your hugs and this and that. So he eventually just grabs her and tells her to get dressed and be ready in a couple minutes, and then they're gonna go. So eventually they get dressed, and he ultimately is telling them, okay, like, now we need to go. And recently the girls are going against this, of course, and it kind of gets to the point to where um, there's this exchange back and forth consistently, and Keanu is not really putting up with this anymore, and he just picks up the phone, calls, of course, 911, and tells the police, yeah, I'm experiencing a break-in. And so immediately the girl hangs up the phone, and they get in the car, and they immediately drive away. Ultimately, the girls tell him some address, and so he drops them off and then comes back home. He ultimately comes back home to uh, to eventually assume that all is well. That basically he's gonna put on his music again, and all is gonna be well. All of a sudden, he hears a drop of some photo, and then pretty much after that, we started seeing a vandalization of Keanu's wife's artwork, and to where ultimately, again, um, it eventually that escalates later on, but he ultimately grabs this photo and gets bonked on the head by one of the women. So we have it to where the girls are tying him to this bed, ultimately waiting for us to queue up the adult content. And so basically, we have to where the girls are basically uh, they're basically just like, it seems like everything is a game to them, so everything has like a game and a scenario and this and that. So ultimately we get to the aspect of Keanu um, being tied up, and game ensues. And so ultimately we have it to where this thing is in all actuality being cameraed. The video is taking place, and ultimately I'm assuming is being put live on Facebook. So ultimately, Keanu eventually escapes from said bed, kicks the girl, and eventually tries to escape said bed, to ultimately end up being stabbed in the shoulder. And Keanu's like, "Oh, my shoulder," because supposedly he had gotten surgery for the shoulder. There's a scar there and everything. So basically, after getting severely wounded in the shoulder, Keanu Reeves wakes up, and now he is tied to said chair with headphones being put onto his head, ultimately to play a game. So basically, if before um, there wasn't like a weird, bizarre-ish game going on of kind of like playing around with Keanu before, now here is the grand prize of real, true guessing game of guess the question right, and you won't go deaf. So reasonably, every single time the girl has a plate with multiple answers. And so, of course, Keanu has to answer the right one, or, of course, his ears will be ruined to multiple times where he screams out, "I'm gonna go deaf, I'll go deaf, don't do this, I'll go deaf." like, I need my ears, I'll go deaf, blah, 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 blah. So, reasonably, he doesn't quite really understand, like, why they are doing this to him, because he's like, dude, like, I was nice to you, I gave you pizza, and it's like, you were tempting me, there is nothing I can do. It's like, bullsh, like, you didn't have to let us in, and this and that. So every single time there is a question, and a bulk of the time he tends to get every answer for the most of the point wrong, even if it probably is right, because they rig the game to ultimately just mess with him. To the point where eventually, again, like I said, they do completely ruin um, his wife's statue, to the point of um, him having to refix that statue, get like paint thinner to uh, ultimately get all the permanent marker marks off the statue, and then eventually, um, and this is when this happens when he is ultimately kind of trying to get rid of them at first, and so ultimately, at some point while he is getting tied up, here's where the crazy crap starts happening. So we eventually get one of his um, wife's work associates coming over to pick up his wife's art. And so, reasonably, we have it to where this guy is coming over, pick up this art, and so reasonably, what happens is that these girls are there, and they eventually just, um, while he eventually the friend ultimately tries to help Keanu, eventually he notices that the two girls are just wrecking this sculpture, and he's like, no, no. And then eventually it gets down to him, like, getting so horrified by this sculpture being ruined that eventually he just has a heart attack and dies right there at the worst possible time. And so ultimately, they they get a van going, and they basically get rid of the body and the sculpture at the same time. So basically, what ends up happening at the very end of all this, after all the games have been had and everything has been played, eventually we have Keanu Reeves that is pretty much has a hole in the ground with his name on it. And so basically, he is dragged all the way into this hole, tossed in there, and then ultimately he is given an ultimatum after he is buried alive. Because ultimately, Keanu Reeves is telling him, "Please don't do this. Like, come on. Don't do this to me." And so ultimately, they say, "Okay, well, I'm willing to forgive you and finally resolve this if you confess to your family. If you confess to your family, then all will be well." So because ultimately these girls seemingly know so much about him, to the point of even knowing that none of his neighbors were around within the neighborhood because everyone was going on vacation. And because basically when he escapes and runs out of the home, he doesn't get very far because again they mapped out this entire place. Ultimately, knowing full well that they have done this time and time again and know how to perfectly not only research all these people, but eventually even know something as simple as the one time that Keanu Reeves talks about the monster and everything like that. So it seems like they have a thorough knowledge about Keanu, and so ultimately they tell him it's like he needs to confess because really his crime is that he let them in. Ultimately, he could have said no at any point in time, and instead he didn't. And that is his true crime. Is that they ultimately could have said Keanu could have ultimately said no, and they would have stopped doing this. But since he had said yes, they're ultimately going to lead into finding yet another home to do this to another person, which I was ultimately assuming there was going to be a knock knock too at some point, but maybe I guess this movie didn't quite um, go enough to go anywhere to ultimately lead to a sequel, but it would have been nice. It would have been nice to kind of see if there was like a bigger uh, A-lister star or whatever that this kind of ends up like happening to yet again. Maybe it could be a female variation, which would kind of be interesting, or who knows. So going into this, yeah, we have Keanu Reeves who had seemingly been thrusted into his own hole and now is going to have to confess to his wife of what he had done. And basically, so they had told him like, hey, well, all right, Slugger, we're gonna give her a call and go straight to voicemail. So he supposedly starts to confess. He's like, yeah, I'm sorry to have to tell you this, but I'm kidnapped and call the police, call 911. And of course, this is, of course, not the answer that they wanted. Um, Basically, it seemed like they were going to kill Keanu by, like, I think, like, dropping a phone book or something on top of him. And ultimately, they had purposely missed to frighten him that he was going to die. So what had happened is that instead we had it very much to be that ultimately, like I said, the girls like basically do this all the time because they know men will always give in to temptation. Like they always want to cheat. It's so tempting. Blah 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 blah. So reasonably, that's why they knew that Keanu's character would bend to this. So at the end of the day, uh, Keanu didn't confess the phone. They threatened to kill him. Ultimately, at some point, even having a gun at him at some point um, to keep them doing what he wanted. Because ultimately, Keanu had a gun in his home. And of course, with them really going through his home, especially when he didn't know any better, and kind of going through his things, rifling through his stuff, knowing so much about him and figuring out all the stuff that he ultimately uh, likes and this and that. So basically, cue the family coming home and finding their husband in basically the ground. And yeah, kind of makes for an interesting ending at the end of the day. A lot of explaining to do. And yeah, I think that's pretty much wraps this movie up. I kind of went through this severely quickly. There's a lot of details that I left out, but without a doubt, for people who have probably seen this movie, um, yeah, I apologize for not going into details. I think at some point I had kind of here and there kind of reviewed this movie through a couple different kinds of times. And I think this time around was kind of a little less detailed, a little bit more vague at some points. But then again, there were some times of real rewatching and memory and stuff like that, kind of playing back into my head of just like, okay, like some stuff might have been out of order and this and that, but ultimately, other than that, yeah, fairly interesting movie. I really enjoyed it at the end of the day, but yeah, like I kind of said, a little bit vague on the details, but yeah, pretty decent movie in my mind. So, other than that, I'm going to get out of here. Bye, everybody. Bye, everybody.